Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Do you know your true worth? Yesterday, something unbelievable happened to me, and it started with one sentence from my mother. We were sitting at a long table after my graduation, the kind of dinner that is supposed to feel like the moment you finally breathe after years of struggling through papers, side jobs, and sleepless nights. Everyone was laughing, passing bread baskets, and congratulating me, and then Mom leaned toward me as if she were about to say something sweet and supportive. Instead, she whispered in my ear, "We'll use your cash gifts for your brother's tuition." That was it. No question, no pause, just a flat statement as though she were announcing which dessert she had ordered. In that moment, I felt two things at once. The first was the familiar wave of disappointment that had shadowed most of my teenage years, the reminder that in my family my role was to work, to save, and to make sacrifices so my younger brother could have what was always framed as his chance at success. The second feeling, though, was calmer, almost cold, because I had been expecting this exact move. I had known, deep down, that the money given to me that night would never be safe if I left it floating in the hands of parents who saw my achievements as a resource to redistribute. And, because I had been waiting for it, I had already made sure that the conversation would not end the way my mom imagined. I stayed quiet. I did not argue or push back. I just nodded slightly, as if I had barely heard her, and turned back to my plate. I knew she thought silence meant agreement, and I let her believe that, because the next few minutes were going to unravel her confidence in a way that words from me never could. When the main courses had been cleared, my mentor, Professor Avery Holt, arrived. I had invited him not just as a thank you, but also because I needed a witness, someone steady who knew what I had been through. He congratulated me, clinked glasses politely, and then, without fanfare, slid an envelope across the table toward me. "Good thing we prepared," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight that everyone nearby stopped for a second. I took the envelope and placed it near my plate, but before I could even open it, Mom reached across, as though it naturally belonged to her, and pulled it toward herself. She tore it open quickly, clearly expecting checks, maybe even a letter of donation. What she found was not what she expected. The first page was a confirmation letter from the university's bursar's office. It stated clearly that all graduation gift checks deposited through the department had already been routed into a custodial account under my name, an account set up weeks earlier with the university's advancement office, with myself as the only person authorized to withdraw or transfer funds. It spelled out, in bureaucratic clarity, that any additional gifts handed over at the dinner would be matched by a small merit extension the department had arranged, doubling their impact but locking them into my control only. Her face froze, not in anger at first, but in the stunned realization that she had miscalculated. Dad went silent immediately, staring at the table as though the words on that page were in a language he could not speak. Tyler, my younger brother, looked confused, glancing from me to Mom as if he could not understand why the celebration suddenly felt heavy. The only one who looked unfazed was Professor Holt, who simply sipped his water and let the paper speak for itself. I took a breath and, with a tone as even as I could manage, I thanked everyone for celebrating with me. Then I asked the servers to pass around small index cards I had brought, each with a simple printed message. "If you brought a card, please hand it directly to Rachel or Professor Holt." No instructions about checks, no mention of cash, just a polite redirect that took away the ambiguity my mom usually relied on. There was no scene, no dramatic argument, just a quiet change in the flow of the evening that made it impossible for her to quietly collect and reallocate what was never hers to control. The rest of the dinner felt stiff, but I kept my smile. I talked with relatives about job applications, thanked friends for their kind words, and nodded when someone asked about my plans. Inside, though, I felt a shift I had been craving for years. It was the first time I had not just defended myself, but actually anticipated the move before it happened. It was like winning a chess match not with a bold strike, but with a slow, methodical positioning of pieces long before the opponent realized the game had already been decided. Mom leaned back toward me just before dessert and said quietly, "We will talk at home." Her voice had a sharpness that cut through the chatter of the table, but I did not flinch. I turned to her, smiled faintly, and answered just as softly, "We will, but not the way you think." For once, I did not feel like the child in the conversation. I felt like the one holding the key, because the truth was simple. She had no idea how much more preparation I had already done. She thought the envelope was the end of it, but it was only the first move. And here is where the real story begins. Can you guess what else I found when I pulled my credit report? By the time I got home from the dinner and took off my shoes, the quiet in the house had the kind of edge that tells you a conversation is not a conversation at all but a verdict waiting to be read. And Mom did not waste time before launching into the speech she has probably rehearsed in her head for years, the one about family pulling together and resources being shared and how, since I now had a degree and a job offer, it made sense for the graduation money to flow to the person who was just starting out, which was her gentle way of saying my brother's name without having to face the part where she was taking something given to me and rerouting it without consent. I listened, because I have learned that arguing too early gives away energy, and when she paused to check whether I understood, I kept my voice steady and told her I did understand, not the part about obligation, but the part about patterns, because I had spent the last few months documenting every one of them. I put a thin folder on the table, not to make a scene, but because people forget timelines when they are inconvenient, and I walked her through a straightforward list that did not need commentary: my part-time jobs and the hours stacked on top of classes, the scholarships that had not fallen out of the sky, but had come from applications filled at midnight while other people slept, the transfers from my campus bank into the account I had opened, and then the one page that changed the temperature in the room, which was the copy of a credit report I had pulled in the spring when a financial aid officer mentioned that graduates should check their files before moving, because hidden mistakes can follow you for years. On that report there was an old account in my name, a small credit line opened during my sophomore year, labeled as an emergency card with my address, but not my handwriting, which I had quietly paid down over several months so interest would not grow and so I would not blow up at anyone before I knew exactly what had happened. I did not accuse her. I did not need to. I pointed to the dates, the amounts, and the fact that the bank had already sent me a closure letter that I had filed, because I promised myself I would never again be surprised by paperwork someone else filled out for me. Mom tried to pivot into the story where she saved me once during a health scare that semester, which is true in the narrow sense that she brought soup and told me to rest, but also not the full picture, because what really got me through was a campus nurse, a friend who sat with me through an urgent appointment, and the small emergency grant the department issued when I missed a week of work and rent did not care about my body, and I said this carefully because I was not erasing her effort. I was right-sizing it, and that difference matters if you want a relationship that is not a ledger with your name on the wrong side. Then I did something I should have done sooner, and maybe the reason I had not done it was because I wanted to believe love would be enough, but love without boundaries is just access. So I took out my phone, put the call on speaker, and told the bursar's office I wanted to add a password to my student account for any phone inquiries going forward, after which I thanked the clerk, hung up, and then called the bank to confirm that no one but me had authority on any account tied to my social security number, and when that was done I opened the credit bureau site and froze my credit, not because I was preparing for a fight in court, but because I was done leaving open doors that kept getting walked through by people who swear they are only trying to help. I told Mom, gently but clearly, that I had also removed her as my emergency contact and listed my mentor and my best friend instead, because emergencies require people who respect the person in trouble, not the chance to reorganize their life while they are vulnerable, and I watched the words land, not as knives, but as a line finally drawn. Dad sat there with his hands folded, looking at the folder as though it might explode if he touched it, and when I asked him if he had known about the old account he said he thought there was something like that, and he did not want to start a fight back then. Which is the sentence that explains 1,000 small cuts in a family, the choice to avoid a storm by letting someone else stand in the rain, and I nodded not because it was fine but because naming it out loud was better than pretending. Confusion. When the conversation slid toward guilt, as it always does, I put a second set of pages on the table. A short email chain with the department administrator who had helped set up the custodial route for graduation gifts and who had confirmed in writing that any checks accidentally handed to relatives at the dinner would be reissued directly to me once the gift log cleared, which meant the old trick of collecting cards and organizing the contents would not work this time, and I could see the realization settle on Mom's face that the river she had always redirected had been forced into its proper banks by simple, boring guardrails. I kept my tone even, because my goal was not humiliation but closure, and I said that from now on I would be the one who decided where my money went. An hour later, after the house had gone quiet, and I had started to clean up the dishes because motion helps the adrenaline leave my body, my phone lit up with a notification from a payment app. A request from Tyler with a cheerful note that said Mom had told him I would cover his housing deposit, so could I please send it by tonight, and I actually laughed. Not at him, but at the timing. Because the request bounced immediately with a message that I do not accept requests, and I wrote back a single line telling him that we would talk directly and that any help from me would not go through Mom, which was not a threat so much as a promise to break the habit of letting her be the gatekeeper to every decision in our lives. I know some people will say I should have sat everyone down and tried to negotiate a softer compromise, but the truth is that I have tried that version too many times, and at some point the fair middle is just the old arrangement with nicer words. So I chose clarity instead, and as I put the folder back on my shelf, I felt the first clean breath I have taken in years. The next day I would invite a few relatives for coffee, not to start a rumor war, but to put the boring truth on the table and let them decide whether they cared about it, because when paperwork closes in, people run to opinion. And I was not going to let a story I had earned be replaced by a story that made someone else comfortable. Can you guess what happens when the lie travels faster than the facts, and you decide to take the microphone without throwing a single punch? When the dust settled from the first round of conversations at home, I realized that the real battle was no longer about the money sitting in an account under my name, but about the story already being whispered around our relatives and family friends. My mother had a way of turning situations upside down so that, by the time others heard about them, she looked like the victim of some ungrateful child who had lost touch with family values. Within days, I was hearing secondhand comments through cousins and even an old neighbor about how I had hoarded my graduation gifts out of spite, as though refusing to hand them over was some moral failure rather than the most basic boundary. It became clear to me that this was not simply about dollars anymore. It was about reputation, about who gets to define the truth when everyone else only catches fragments of the story. I made a decision that I was not going to let silence carry the lie farther than it already had. But instead of blasting back on social media or writing some defensive manifesto, I chose a quieter, sharper move. I called two of my aunts, one cousin who had actually seen me juggle work shifts with class, and my dad, and I asked them to meet me for coffee one Saturday morning. When we gathered, I didn't waste time dressing it up. I placed a simple stack of papers on the table, the same ones I had shown my mom, the bursar confirmation, the scholarship match letter, and the printout of the old emergency account that had appeared on my credit report. I wasn't looking for sympathy, I was putting down receipts. As I talked, I stayed calm and deliberate. I explained how Mom had claimed at dinner that my cash gifts would be rerouted to my brother, and how she had already begun telling relatives that my refusal to comply was selfish. I didn't add dramatics, because the facts already carried their own weight. My cousin nodded, remembering the nights she saw me at the campus cafe, hunched over a laptop between orders. One aunt asked why I hadn't said anything sooner, and I told her honestly that for years I thought maybe I was overreacting, maybe this was just family sacrifice, until the credit report proved in black and white that my name had been used without my permission. The room shifted after that. There's a silence people fall into when they realize the version of events they've been fed is missing entire chapters, and I watched as the doubt spread across their faces. What made it more powerful was that I didn't stop with the defensive explanation. I pivoted to something constructive, something that reframed the narrative entirely. With help from my mentor Avery, I had set up a small alumni-funded microgrant in my grandmother's name, meant for graduates stepping into their first job without family financial backing. It wasn't large, but it was official, public, and it carried the kind of legitimacy that no whispered complaint could erase. I told my relatives that instead of handing over my own graduation gifts to cover tuition that was never mine to pay, I wanted to pay forward opportunity to others in a way that was transparent and fair. And then I showed them the advancement office's letter confirming that donations to the fund would be matched by the same scholarship program that had doubled my graduation gifts. By the time I finished, the tension in the room was gone. What lingered instead was a quiet recognition that I was not hoarding anything, I was redirecting it with purpose. The story my mother had tried to spread about me being selfish suddenly looked absurd next to a printed confirmation of a scholarship match and a public microgrant program. My aunts asked how they could contribute. My cousin said she would share the information with a few friends from her church. Even Dad, who had stayed mostly silent, finally admitted that he had underestimated how carefully I had prepared. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. It was a photo of my brother's tuition estimate, the numbers circled in red, with a caption underneath, "Look what you could fix in one click." The message was blunt, as though she still believed guilt was my currency. I didn't waste words in my reply. I wrote, "I will help Tyler directly. You will not touch it." That one sentence was more than a refusal, it was a signal that I was finished with the middleman arrangement where she acted as both banker and judge. If my brother needed support, he could talk to me, and I would decide what form that support took. The relief I felt was not just about cutting through one lie, but about realizing I didn't need to argue every detail anymore. The documents and the program spoke louder than any explanation I could give. Relatives now had both sides in front of them, and anyone who chose to cling to Mom's version was doing so willfully. The power of gossip is that it thrives in a vacuum of facts, and once I filled that vacuum with boring, undeniable paperwork, the gossip suddenly looked hollow. But here's the part one didn't expect. Instead of Mom slowing down, she doubled down. She began calling other relatives, saying that I was using the university to embarrass her, that I was dragging family matters into public view. She tried to paint my actions as vindictive rather than strategic. And in that moment, I understood the next level of stakes. When paperwork wins, stories shift to emotion, and people cling to whichever version makes them feel righteous. I had to be ready for the emotional play, the tearful calls, the accusations of betrayal, because once money and facts were no longer on her side, all that remained was performance. As I walked home from that coffee meeting, I replayed Avery's words in my head. Stories move people. Signatures move banks. I had learned how to lock down the financial doors, but now I had to prepare for what came next, the reputational war my mother was determined to wage, one where the truth would not matter nearly as much as how convincingly she could cry on the phone. And I knew that if I wanted to win the next round, I couldn't just defend myself again. I would have to create a new story strong enough to drown out the old one. Do you know what happens when the truth is boring but the lie is entertaining? That is exactly the stage we were about to step onto, and I was not planning to stand there quietly. The weeks that followed made it clear that my mother had no intention of letting the story fade into the background, and instead of retreating after my relatives began to see through the narrative she had been spinning, she escalated in ways that revealed just how unwilling she was to release control. I began receiving calls from relatives I rarely spoke to, each conversation carrying the same undertone of concern mixed with suspicion, as though they had been primed to ask why I was making things so difficult, when a little flexibility could supposedly fix everything. What they did not realize was that what they were asking me to do was not a small act of generosity, but an invitation to return to a pattern of erasure, where my achievements, my savings, and even my name were tools to build someone else's future while my own was treated as expendable. It was exhausting, but I knew this phase was less about money now and more about whether I had the stamina to hold my boundaries under constant pressure. And then, almost on cue, the next revelation arrived, this time not through a whisper or a rumor, but through a letter in the mail. I opened an envelope from a bank I had never used and stared at a notice about a dormant credit line in my name, something that had apparently been opened years earlier and was now flagged for inactivity. My hands did not shake the way they might have once, because by this point I was conditioned to expect hidden traps, but the weight in my chest was heavy. I knew immediately that this was not just about money. This was about legal exposure, about the possibility that my identity had been leveraged without my knowledge in ways that could follow me for years. I took the letter straight to Avery, who listened without interruption before pulling out his phone and contacting the university's legal clinic, which offered guidance to graduates navigating financial or contractual disputes. Within days, we had drafted a calm but firm dispute letter requesting the original application with the supposed signature, and while part of me hoped it was a clerical error, another part of me already knew that the handwriting would not match mine. The truth was closing in, and the difference this time was that I was not alone when it surfaced. When I told my dad about the letter, he looked down, rubbed his forehead, and admitted quietly that he thought there was something like that back when I was in school, but hadn't wanted to cause a fight at the time. That one sentence cut deeper than almost anything else, because it confirmed what I had suspected. Silence had been the family strategy, and I had been left to pay the price. I didn't scream or slam doors. I simply told him that his avoidance had turned into my burden, and while I could not change what had been done, I could make sure it never happened again. The act of revenge that followed was not dramatic but deliberate. I filed an identity misuse report with supporting documents, sent copies to both of my parents, and attached a note that said, "This is no longer private." It was not a threat, it was a record, and by creating that record, I made it impossible for anyone to later claim confusion or misunderstanding. My mother's face when she read it was a mix of fury and disbelief, because for the first time, the consequences of her choices were written in a system she could not charm her way out of. At the same time, I chose to draw a clean line between my mother's behavior and my brother's needs, because I refused to let him be used as an excuse for her actions. I called Tyler directly, told him I understood that he was about to start school, and explained that I would support him only under conditions that ensured he took responsibility for himself. I laid out a plan. If he accepted a campus job that Avery had already lined up through his network, and if he enrolled in a financial literacy course offered by the university, I would match whatever he earned and place those funds into a separate account managed by the school. That way, he would still receive help, but my mother would have no access to it, and every dollar would be tied to his own effort. Tyler resisted at first, saying Mom told him I was being controlling, but I explained that what I was offering was independence, not control, because this arrangement meant he would not have to beg anyone for money ever again if he stuck with it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was speaking to him as a sibling rather than as a reluctant second parent, and I told him that if he wanted to step into adulthood, this was the doorway. He didn't commit on the spot, but he didn't reject it either, which was more than I had expected. A week later, the bank responded to our dispute letter, and the email made my heart pound even though I had already known what it would say. The signature on the old application was not a match, and the bank asked me to confirm whether I wished to proceed with the full investigation. I stared at the screen, thought about the years of silence, the whispered deals, and the weight of being told that family comes first, when what that really meant was that I came last. Then I typed one word, yes, and hit send. In that moment, I realized the stakes had shifted once again. What had begun as a fight over my graduation money had escalated to social reputation, and now it had crossed into legal territory with real consequences. I was no longer just defending myself, I was dismantling a structure that had defined our family for decades. And I knew that once the investigation unfolded, there would be no way to put the pieces back together in the neat, quiet way my mother preferred. The irony is that I did not want a courtroom or a scandal. What I wanted was a life where I could build my future without the constant fear that someone I loved would reach into my pockets or sign my name when I wasn't looking. Filing that report was not about punishing my parents, it was about ending an era where their choices defined my limits. And as much as it hurt to admit, the only way forward was through exposure. I ended that night sitting alone in my apartment, replaying the conversation with Tyler in my head, realizing that the only way to save him from the same cycle was to prove, through my actions, that boundaries are not cruelty, they are survival. The cliffhanger in my own life was not whether my mother would forgive me, but whether my brother would choose to step through the door I had opened for him. And as I turned off my phone, the unanswered question lingered. What would he do when he realized the rules had finally changed, and I was no longer the family wallet? The alumni dinner was supposed to be a simple farewell, a small gathering before I packed up for the fellowship that Avery had helped me secure, but it turned into the stage for the final confrontation, the one where all the threads of control, silence, and reputation collided in full view of people my mother had always hoped to impress. I had kept quiet in the days leading up to it, not because I was retreating, but because I understood the power of timing, and I wanted my words to land when she least expected them, in a place where performance alone could not cover the truth. When I walked into that room, I felt the weight of every compromise I had once made pressing on my shoulders, but I also carried the calm certainty that this time the ending would belong to me. Mom was already there, moving from table to table with the ease of someone who knew how to collect goodwill like loose change. She greeted old classmates of my father, complimented donors on their children, and carried herself as though the last few months had been nothing more than a minor misunderstanding, one already forgiven and forgotten. She smiled at me when I entered, the kind of smile that tried to fold me back into her story, but I simply nodded, took my seat, and waited. I had no intention of starting a fight in private corners, because I had learned that when battles happen in the dark, the strongest voice controls the memory. This one would happen in the light. When the dinner reached the point where Avery was invited to speak, he took the microphone, said a few kind words about the graduates, and then turned directly toward me. He spoke about perseverance, about students who carry burdens unseen by most, and then he announced that I had been awarded a fellowship that would take me out of state, covering living expenses for the first year while I built a career. The applause filled the room, but over the sound I caught the stiffening of my mother's posture, because she had been telling people for weeks that I was floundering, that my selfishness had cut me off from opportunities. And now she had to sit while the opposite was announced into a microphone. And then came the moment I had prepared for since the night of my graduation dinner. Avery explained that the envelope he had slid across the table weeks earlier had contained not only the custodial account documents, but also a notarized agreement with the university's advancement office. That agreement locked every dollar of my graduation gifts into a prepaid tuition fund designated for a family member of my choice, managed by the university itself with conditions attached. The room went quiet as he revealed that I had named my brother Tyler as the beneficiary, with the stipulation that the funds would only release after he completed a financial literacy course and maintained steady progress in school. It was not cruel, it was conditional help, stripped of manipulation, and delivered in a way that bypassed my mother entirely. The look on her face was something I will never forget. For the first time, she had no move to make, no way to twist the story into martyrdom, because the act itself was public, generous, and beyond her control. Relatives clapped, donors smiled, and the advancement office representative nodded in approval, because from their perspective I had done something responsible and forward-thinking. From mine, I had finally rewritten the terms of our family's history. I could help without being used, I could protect without being erased, and I could define the rules instead of having them defined for me. When I took the microphone briefly to thank the donors and the department, I allowed myself one sentence aimed at the heart of the matter. I said, I learned from my family that money should come with responsibility, not control. It was framed as gratitude, but it was also a line in the sand, one my mother could not argue against without exposing everything she had tried to hide. The applause that followed was not thunderous, but it was steady, and in that steady sound I heard the closing of a door that had stayed open too long. After the dinner, Mom cornered me near the exit, her voice low and sharp. She said, "You made me look small tonight." I looked her in the eyes, not with anger but with finality, and I answered, "No, I made the rules clear." That was the end of the conversation. She walked away, shoulders stiff, and for the first time in my life I did not feel the urge to run after her or soften the blow. I had drawn the boundary, and whether she accepted it or not was no longer my problem. The next morning, as I began packing boxes for the move, I received a message from Tyler. It was a screenshot of his registration for the financial course, with a short line that said, "I guess this is the only way forward." I stared at it for a long time, not because it solved everything, but because it meant he had chosen to step through the door I had left open. It meant that maybe, just maybe, he could break free of the pattern that had trapped me for years. I know some people might say I went too far, that public exposure was unnecessary, that I could have kept this battle within the family. But the truth is that every private compromise I had made before only cemented the pattern deeper, and silence had cost me more than words ever could. This time, the exposure was not about humiliation. It was about survival, about reclaiming my name and my future. As I taped up the final box, I realized that the victory was not just in keeping my money or in redirecting it responsibly. The real victory was in no longer being afraid of what would happen if I said no. I had turned the tables without becoming cruel, and I had left behind a blueprint for my brother to follow if he wanted out too. I will not pretend that everything is resolved or that my mother suddenly saw the error of her ways. The truth is messier than that, and family ties do not vanish with one confrontation. But what I do know with absolute clarity is that I am no longer the family wallet, and I will never again be the silent resource waiting to be harvested. That era ended the night she opened the envelope, and the life I am building now begins with the word I finally learned to say and mean: enough.